The invasion fleet arrived too early. Not early by hours or even days, but early in a way that made no sense according to every projection the Empire had trusted for the past 6 years. Their calculations had been precise, their intelligence exhaustive, their timing aligned to the slow rhythms of a primitive world that should not have noticed them until the first strike had already begun. And yet, the moment their ships crossed into the outer boundary of the system, something felt wrong. Not a weapon signature, not a defensive formation. Something quieter than that, something deliberate. Every major human city went dark at the exact same second. From orbit, the third planet did not erupt into panic. There were no scattered bursts of emergency broadcasts, no chaotic signals flooding the electromagnetic spectrum, no signs of a civilization scrambling to survive. There was only silence, a complete, synchronized blackout across an entire world that should not have been capable of that level of coordination under surprise attack. The fleet's sensor rays swept the surface again and again, searching for hidden power sources, underground grids, emergency relays, anything that might explain what they were seeing. There was nothing. The admiral standing at the center of the flagship's command chamber did not speak for several seconds, and that alone unsettled his crew more than any alarm could have. He had commanded campaigns across 12 systems, each one executed with the same predictable pattern: arrival, demonstration of force, collapse of resistance. This was supposed to be simpler than all of them. The reports had been clear. The species was fractured, technologically uneven, politically divided, a world that argued with itself more than it prepared for anything beyond its own orbit, and yet the planet below him had just gone completely silent, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. A transmission appeared on the main display. It did not originate from a military channel or a government relay, or any of the infrastructure the Empire had cataloged during its survey missions. It came from a single point on the planet's surface, a location buried beneath layers of interference that should have rendered it invisible. The signal bypassed every known security protocol and appeared directly on the flagship's command feed as if it had been invited there. The message contained only 3 words. You arrived early. No signature. No encryption. No demand. For a brief moment, no one in the chamber moved. The words hung in the air with a weight that no translation error could explain. Early implied expectation. Expectation implied preparation. And preparation, in this context, implied something the Empire's intelligence reports had completely failed to account for. The Admiral replayed the message twice, then a third time, searching for hidden data, embedded code, anything that might reveal more than what had been said. There was nothing, just the same 3 words, delivered with calm precision, as if the sender had no doubt they would be understood exactly as intended. Behind him, a junior officer finally broke the silence. Sir, their grid is still down. No power signatures. No defensive systems active. That was what unsettled him the most. If this had been a trap, there should have been movement, energy spikes, fleet deployments, something visible, something measurable, something that fit within the framework of every war doctrine he had spent his life mastering. Instead, the system remained quiet. The asteroid belts drifted undisturbed. The orbital lanes were empty. Even the planet's satellites, those simple observational platforms the Empire had dismissed as harmless, remained dark. It was as if the entire system had chosen not to react. A second transmission request flickered briefly across the edge of command display, originating not from Earth, but from somewhere deeper within the fleet's own communication network. It vanished before it could be traced, leaving behind only a fragment of corrupted data that none of the ship's systems could immediately decode. The Admiral's gaze hardened. "Advance!" he said at last, his voice steady, controlled, unchanged, because there was only one way to understand a silence like this. You walked into it, and somewhere on that darkened world below, someone had just confirmed that you were exactly where they wanted you to be. The official report said Earth should have been panicking by now. That was the first inconsistency the Galactic Concord noticed, and it spread through the chamber like a slow fracture no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. The invasion feed streamed in real time across the central display, showing a planet that refused to behave according to every model the Concord had relied on for over a decade. No emergency coalitions forming, no fragmented military responses, no desperate attempts to negotiate survival, just a silent world rotating beneath an advancing armada, as if the presence of 300 warships in its orbit required no reaction at all. Ambassador Lena Cross did not look at the screen when the murmurs began. She had already seen enough. For 11 years, she had sat in that chamber while humanity was measured, categorized, and quietly dismissed. Every report filed about Earth had been technically accurate, and completely wrong in every way that mattered. The Concord had documented human infrastructure, trade routes, political disputes, and technological limitations. They had recorded everything that was visible, and like every empire before them, they had assumed that what was visible was all that existed. Now, they were watching the consequence of that assumption unfold in real time. They are not responding, one of the senior delegates said, his voice edged with confusion that bordered on irritation. There are no defensive formations, no fleet mobilization, no atmospheric activity consistent with planetary shields or surface weapon systems. This is not resistance. This is absence. Lena finally turned her head. It is not absence, she said quietly. It is control. The chamber stilled for a fraction of a second, then resumed its low wave of discussion, as if her words had not been spoken at all. That, more than anything, confirmed what she already knew. They were still thinking in terms of what they could see, still trying to force the situation into a framework that had never accounted for a species like hers. On the central display, the invading fleet began its slow advance inward. The formation was precise, deliberate, and overwhelmingly confident. Their forward units moved through the outer debris fields without deviation, their sensors sweeping continuously for threats that did not appear. The deeper they moved into the system, the more the silence seemed to expand around them, stretching across empty space and unlit infrastructure like a boundary they could not define. And yet, something was happening. It was subtle at first. Small course corrections made by the lead ships, adjustments so minor they barely registered as anomalies, but they were consistent. Each correction aligned the fleet more precisely along a narrow corridor through the system, a path that curved slightly off the most direct route to Earth. The navigation systems attributed the adjustments to gravitational variance, minor fluctuations in the local field generated by the system's gas giants and asteroid density. But the pattern was too clean. Lena watched the data stream with a focus that bordered on stillness. She had seen this before, not in practice, but in theory, in proposals that had never been publicly acknowledged, in research projects that had been labeled as civilian infrastructure development and quietly approved without further scrutiny. The Concord had approved them. That was the part that almost made her smile. They are being guided, she said. This time, a few heads turned. Guided? Another delegate repeated. By what? There are no active systems in that region. That you can detect, Lena replied. On the display, the fleet continued its advance, unaware that every correction it made was narrow in its options. The corridor they were following was not the fastest route to Earth. It was not the safest. It was simply the only one that now made sense to their instruments. The admiral aboard the flagship felt it too, not as a warning, not yet, but as a discomfort he could not fully articulate. His tactical officers reported no threats, no anomalies beyond minor environmental inconsistencies. The system remained quiet, compliant with every expectation of a defenseless target. And yet, the deeper they moved, the more the silence began to feel structured, intentional. Maintain formation, he ordered, though no one had suggested otherwise, because turning back without cause would have been unthinkable. The Empire did not hesitate. It did not second-guess. It moved forward until resistance forced it to stop, and there had been no resistance. Not yet. Back in the Concord chamber, a secondary report arrived from a long-range observation relay positioned near the system's outer boundary. It contained a fragment of data that did not match any known natural phenomenon. A brief fluctuation in space-time curvature, localized and precise, appearing and disappear within a fraction of a second. No one in the chamber could explain it. Lena did not look surprised. She had read the early proposals, the ones that had never been fully understood by anyone outside a small circle of engineers and strategists. The ones that described systems designed not to destroy an enemy fleet outright, but to shape its movement, to influence decisions without ever revealing the hand behind them, to make an opponent believe they were choosing their own path. They think they are advancing, she said softly. On the display, the fleet crossed an invisible threshold. Nothing changed. No weapons fired. No alarms triggered. No visible reaction from the silent world ahead. But every ship in that formation had just entered a region of space that had been waiting for them long before they had ever decided to come. And for the first time since the invasion began, Lena Cross felt something shift. Not fear, anticipation. Because the next move would not come from the fleet. It would come from whatever humanity had been building in the dark. By the time the fleet reached the orbit of Mars, the silence had stopped feeling like an absence and started feeling like pressure. It was not something the sensors could quantify, not a measurable force or detectable signal, but it was there in the behavior of the systems themselves. Navigation arrays recalibrated more frequently than expected. Long-range scans returned perfectly clean data. Too clean, as if minor background noise had been intentionally removed. Even internal diagnostics began flagging inconsistencies that resolved themselves before they could be fully analyzed. The Admiral watched it all, without changing his expression. "Status?" he asked, though he already knew what the answer would be. "System integrity remains within operational parameters," his chief officer replied. "No confirmed hostile activity. No active defense systems detected. No fleet presence." It was a flawless report, and that was the problem. A defenseless system did not behave like this. A primitive world did not maintain this level of environmental consistency under the pressure of an incoming invasion. Somewhere, something was controlling variables that should not have been controllable, and doing so with a level of precision that bordered on invisible. Ahead of them, Mars rotated slowly in the darkness, its surface marked by scattered colonies the Empire had long ago classified as civilian expansions, mining operations, research stations, agricultural domes, none of them capable of meaningful resistance, none of them worth a second look. And yet, as the fleet sensors swept across the planet, a series of brief anomalies appeared and vanished almost instantly. Power fluctuations, microsignals, heat signatures that did not align with any known industrial pattern. "Magnify," the Admiral ordered. The display zoomed in on one of the Martian installations, isolating it against the surrounding terrain. For a fraction of a second, something moved beneath the surface, a pattern of energy redistribution that suggested activation, not failure. Then it was gone, leaving behind only the static image of a quiet, harmless colony. Repeat scan. "Negative, sir. No anomaly detected." The Admiral leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the empty data. "Log it," he said, because ignoring something like that was how mistakes were made. The fleet continued its advance. Behind Mars, the navigation corridor tightened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible unless one knew what to look for. The gravitational models adjusted again, refining the fleet's path through a region of space that now offered fewer viable alternatives. Every adjustment seemed logical, necessary, even optimal. There was no indication that the fleet was being forced into anything, only that every other option was becoming less efficient, less correct. On the flagship's lower decks, a junior analyst hesitated over a console. "Sir, I'm seeing pattern alignment across our trajectory adjustments." The Admiral did not turn. "Explain." "Our course corrections are converging toward a fixed spatial vector," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "It's consistent across all ships, independent of local calculations. We're not just adjusting to the environment. We're aligning with something." "Define something." "I can't," she admitted. "There's no identifiable source. It's not a signal, not a field we can isolate. It's just there." Silence settled over the command chamber again, heavier this time. The Admiral considered the data for a long moment, then spoke with the same measured calm he had maintained since the beginning. "Maintain current course, because deviation without cause would be worse than continuing forward." And there was still no confirmed threat. Back in the Concorde chamber, the atmosphere had changed. The early amusement had faded, replaced by a focused stillness that carried a different kind of weight. Delegates who had dismissed Earth's capabilities hours ago were now watching the feed with intensity that bordered on unease. The absence of visible defense had stopped being reassuring. It had become unsettling. A new report appeared on the shared display. Archive construction permits, decades old, filed under categories so mundane they had never warranted deeper review. Orbital infrastructure expansions, deep space research arrays, civilian transport networks, resource redistribution projects across asteroid belts and outer system bodies. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern no one had noticed before. Lena Cross did not look at the screen. She already knew what it showed. They approved all of it, she said quietly. A nearby delegate turned toward her, confusion evident in his expression. Approved what? She met his gaze for a brief moment. Everything they needed on the display. The fleet passed beyond Mars and entered the inner corridor of the system. The region ahead appeared empty. No stations, no fleets, no active defenses, just open space leading toward Earth. The Admiral studied the path before him, his instincts sharpening in a way he could not ignore anymore. Every campaign he had ever led had followed a recognizable pattern. This did not. The absence of resistance was no longer an advantage. It was a variable he could not account for. Advance at reduced speed, he ordered. It was the first adjustment he had made that did not come from the system's own recommendations. And for the first time since the fleet had entered the system, the navigation display flickered. Just once, a brief distortion across the projected trajectory, as if something had reacted to the change. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. Hold formation. Because now he knew they were not just moving through the system. They were being observed. And whatever was watching had just noticed that he was starting to question the path he had been given. Far ahead, beyond the empty corridor, Earth remained dark, waiting. The first ship did not explode. It slowed. That was what confused the fleet more than anything else. There had been no impact warning, no incoming fire, no detectable interference field. One moment, the outer flank cruiser was maintaining perfect formation velocity, and the next it began to decelerate as if something had reached out and taken hold of it. Status, the Admiral said, already stepping forward. Propulsion failure. No. Correction, propulsion is active, the systems officer replied, his voice tightening as new data flooded his console. Engines are firing at full output, but forward momentum is decreasing. How is that possible? We're reading localized gravitational distortion, but it's not natural. It's controlled. The word hung in the air like a fracture. Before anyone could respond, a second ship reported the same condition, then a third. Across the fleet's forward arc, vessels began to lose speed in staggered intervals, each one caught in a region of space that behaved differently from everything around it. The Admiral's gaze snapped to the tactical display. Map it. A grid began to form, overlaying the fleet's position with points of distortion scattered across the corridor they had been following. It was not random. It was structured, precise, invisible until triggered. They've seeded the route, the analyst whispered. Not mines, not weapons, anchors, gravitational anchors embedded in space itself, dormant until the fleet enters specific coordinates. Each one exerted controlled pull, subtle enough to avoid early detection, powerful enough to disrupt formation integrity once activated. Adjust course, the Admiral ordered. Negative. Navigation responded immediately. Alternative vectors are unstable. The distortion field is expanding. Any deviation increases exposure. Of course it did, because the path they had been following was never meant to be the safest route. It was the only survivable one. Across the fleet, ships struggled to maintain cohesion as the invisible field tightened around them. Engines burned hotter. Power reserves spiked. The perfect formation that had entered the system began to stretch, distort, and fracture under forces it could not counter without fully understanding. And still, no weapons fired. Back in the Concorde chamber, the silence had become absolute. No one spoke as the data streamed across the central display, translating the fleet's movements into patterns that even the most skeptical delegates could no longer dismiss. The absence of visible defense had not been a weakness. It had been a concealment strategy. They're controlling the battlefield, one observer said quietly. No, another replied, his voice low with something that sounded dangerously close to realization. They're controlling space. Lena Cross said nothing. She simply watched as the first phase of the system came alive. On the display, a cluster of ships near the fleet's midsection suddenly lurched out of alignment, their trajectories altered by a distortion field that had not existed seconds before. The anchors were not static. They were adjusting, repositioning, adapting to the fleet's attempts to compensate, learning. The Admiral saw it too. Full system analysis, he snapped. I want origin points, activation triggers, everything. Sir, there are no origin points, the analyst replied. The distortions are appearing without a detectable source. It's like the field is being generated from multiple distributed nodes we can't isolate. That was impossible. And yet it was happening. Because the anchors were not centralized. They were part of a network, spread across the system in locations that had been dismissed as irrelevant. Dead moons, abandoned stations, asteroid fragments cataloged as inert. All of it had been infrastructure, hidden in plain sight. Break formation, the Admiral ordered. It was a second deviation he had made from standard doctrine, and this time the consequences were immediate. The moment the fleet began to separate, the distortion field intensified. Ships that had been stable seconds before were pulled into new vectors, their trajectories overlapping in ways that forced emergency maneuvers just to avoid collision. The anchors responded to dispersion by tightening control, reducing the number of viable paths through the corridor even further. The fleet was not being attacked. It was being shaped, reformed. The Admiral said sharply, because he understood now. This system did not punish movement. It punished unpredictability. And somewhere beyond the range of his sensors, something was watching every decision he made and adjusting the environment accordingly. A new alert cut through the tension. Contact, the tactical officer said. Single strike group has broken through the outer distortion layer. They're maintaining velocity toward Earth. The Admiral turned. On the display, a cluster of ships, faster, lighter, and positioned just outside the densest concentration of anchors, had managed to slip past the initial grid. Their trajectory was clean, direct, and dangerously effective. For the first time since entering the system, the fleet had a clear path to its objective. Maintain their advance, the Admiral ordered immediately. All other units hold position and stabilize. Because if even one group reached orbit, they could force engagement into a phase the Empire understood. Orbital dominance, surface suppression, the patterns that had ended every campaign before this one. Back on Earth, deep beneath layers of rock and reinforced structure, a quiet voice spoke into a secure channel. They found the gap. There was no panic in the room, no raised voices, only a brief pause as the information settled into a system that had been expecting variables from the beginning. Good, another voice replied. Track them, it continued. Do not engage. Above the planet, the breakthrough formation advanced, unaware that their success had not disrupted the trap. It had triggered the next stage. Far below them, systems that had remained dormant since the fleet's arrival began to wake, one layer at a time, in places invaders had never thought to look. And for the first time since the invasion began, Earth was about to respond, not to the fleet, but to the mistake they had just made. The first weapon Earth fired was not aimed at the fleet. It never even touched the ship. Instead, the moment the breakthrough formation crossed into high orbital range, every communication channel they carried went silent, not jammed, not disrupted, rewritten. The strike group did not realize it immediately. Their systems continued to function, their displays remained active, and their command feeds showed perfect synchronization with the rest of the fleet. Orders flowed, acknowledgments returned, formations adjusted as expected. It all looked correct, until one of the pilots noticed something impossible. The stars were wrong. At first, it was subtle, a minor deviation in the background alignment, a fractional shift in stellar positioning that should not have been visible without precise calibration tools. But as the pilot ran a deeper scan, the error multiplied. Constellations drifted, reference points shifted. The entire spatial map began to desynchronize from reality. Navigation error, he reported. Corrected. came the response. I can't, he said, his voice tightening. Our systems say we're in orbit. External sensors say we're not where we think we are. That was the moment the illusion broke. Across the strike group, ships began to realize they were no longer operating on shared truth. Their data was consistent internally, but inconsistent externally. Every system they relied on had been quietly altered, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to distort their understanding of where they were and what they were doing. Earth had not fired at them. It had taken control of what they believed. Back in the Concorde chamber, confusion rippled outward as the incoming data fractured into contradictions. Fleet telemetry no longer aligned with observation relays. Positions overlapped where they should not. Ships appeared in two places at once, depending on which system you trusted. This is interference, one delegate insisted. No, another replied, his voice low with something that sounded dangerously like realization. This is manipulation. Lena cross-stepped forward slightly, her gaze fixed on the shifting display. They're not fighting the fleet, she said. They're fighting its perception. And that changed everything, because war doctrine at its core depended on sheer reality, position, velocity, distance. Without those constants, coordination collapsed. Strategy dissolved into isolated decisions made on incomplete or incorrect information. The fleet had prepared for resistance. It had not prepared for doubt. Inside the breakthrough formation, the Admiral's forward units began issuing conflicting commands. Some ships adjusted course based on internal navigation, others based on external sensor data. The result was immediate fragmentation. Formation integrity broke not under force, but under uncertainty. Re-establish synchronization, the Admiral ordered from the flagship, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. We're trying, his communications officer replied, but signal verification protocols are failing. We can't confirm which data streams are authentic. That was when the second layer activated. Across the system, signals began to emerge from points the Concorde had long ignored. Faint at first, fragmented, then stronger. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of transmissions, each one originating from different locations. Asteroid stations, outer colonies, abandoned relay hubs, minor civilizations that had never held enough influence to matter in the larger political structure. Except now they did. These signals, one of the Concorde analysts said, scanning the incoming data with rising disbelief. They're not random. They're coordinated. Lena did not need to look. She already knew. For years, those smaller species had existed on the margins of the Concorde, overlooked, undervalued, dismissed as irrelevant to the balance of power. Many of them had faced the same kind of peacekeeping operations the Empire was now attempting against Earth. Slow annexations, controlled integration, quiet erasure. Earth had listened when they spoke. While the Concorde debated classifications and resource value, humanity had done something far simpler. It had asked questions, and more importantly, it had remembered the answers. They're not alone, Lena said softly. On the central display, the system map expanded, revealing the full scope of what had been hidden: the gravitational anchors, the manipulated corridors, the perception interference grid, all of it interconnected, all of it supported by infrastructure that did not belong to Earth alone. It belonged to a network, a coalition that had never been formally declared, a system built not on power, but on shared experience. They built this together, one delegate whispered, not an empire, a response. Back in the fleet, the Admiral felt the shift the moment it happened. This was no longer a controlled engagement, no longer a predictable campaign against a single target. The system itself had become hostile, not through overwhelming force, but through coordination that extended beyond anything his doctrine accounted for. Full retreat from inner corridor, he ordered. For the first time since the invasion began, the Empire chose to pull back. But even that decision came too late, because the moment the order was issued, the communication grid fractured again. This time, not from interference, from contradiction. Different ships received different versions of the same command. Some turned outward. Others held position. A few accelerated toward Earth, believing the order had been to advance. The fleet was no longer a single entity. It was becoming a collection of isolated units, each operating on a version of reality that could no longer be verified. And somewhere beneath the surface of the darkened world they had come to conquer, humanity watched it happen, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of a species that had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Because the trap had never been about destroying the fleet. It had been about breaking the idea that the fleet could function at all. And now that idea was collapsing. The only question left was how far Earth was willing to let it fall. The fleet did not collapse all at once. It unraveled. From the outside, it still looked intact. Hundreds of warships moving through formation, engines burning, weapons charged. But inside, the cohesion that made it a single force was gone. Orders overlapped, contradicted, and in some cases canceled each other out entirely. Targeting systems locked onto coordinates that shifted mid-calculation. Defensive arrays activated against threats that did not exist, while real vulnerabilities went unrecognized. And through all of it, Earth still had not fired a decisive strike. That was what began to terrify the Concorde. "They're letting it happen," one delegate said, his voice no longer controlled. "They're watching them break apart." Lena Cross did not correct him, because he was finally starting to understand. On the system-wide display, new signals began to emerge, not from Earth directly, but from a network that had been quietly revealing itself piece by piece. Small vessels, dozens at first, then hundreds, appearing along the outer edges of the distorted corridor. They did not resemble warships. Their signatures were inconsistent, their configurations unfamiliar, their energy outputs modest compared to the invading fleet. Refugee transports, mining rigs, long-haul cargo carriers, ships that had never been classified as military assets by any standard database, and yet they move with purpose. They're repositioning, an analyst observed, forming a perimeter. "No," Lena said softly, "they're closing it." Because the corridor the fleet had followed into the system was no longer just a path. It was a boundary. Inside it, the invaders were losing control. Outside it, the rest of the network was sealing every exit. On the flagship, the Admiral stood motionless as the latest report streamed across his display. His fleet was still armed, still operational, still capable of inflicting catastrophic damage if it could re-establish coordination. But every attempt to restore that coordination failed before it could stabilize. "Manual override," he ordered. "All ships. Independent command protocols. Disregard centralized directives." It was the last measure available when a command structure collapsed. It was also exactly what the system had been waiting for. The moment individual ships began acting independently, the environment responded. Localized distortions shifted again, not randomly, but in direct response to each ship's movement. A cruiser attempting to accelerate toward open space found its path bending slightly, forcing it into proximity with another vessel. A destroyer adjusting its trajectory to avoid collision discovered that its new vector placed it within range of a cluster of unidentified signals that had not been there seconds before. The system was no longer reacting to the fleet as a whole. It was reacting to each decision one at a time. They're tracking intent, the Admiral realized. Not position. Intent. Every maneuver, every adjustment, every attempt to regain control was being observed and countered in real time by a network that did not need to overpower the fleet to defeat it. It only needed to stay one step ahead of every choice. "Then stop choosing," he said quietly. For a moment, the command chamber went still. "Sir, all ships hold position. No course adjustments. No targeting changes. Maintain current state." It was a desperate move, but it was the only way to test a pattern. If the system responded to action, then stillness might break its rhythm. For 3 seconds, nothing changed. For 5, the distortion stabilized. For 8, the fleet held. Then the next layer activated. Across the corridor, the seemingly insignificant vessels that had been closing began to emit synchronized bursts of energy. Not weapons fire, something far more precise. Their signals intersected, overlapped, and formed a lattice that extended across the entire operational space. A net, not physical, not visible, but undeniably present. The fleet's systems reacted instantly. Communications blackout. The officer reported. All external signals are being filtered through unknown nodes. Filter them out. We can't. They're integrated into our own transmission pathways. That was when the Admiral understood. The network was not surrounding them. It was inside them. Every signal the fleet sent, every piece of data it processed, was now passing through a system that had been quietly embedded into the environment from the moment they entered the corridor. The refugee ships, the mining platforms, the forgotten outposts, they were not reinforcements. They were infrastructure. And they had just completed their configuration. Back in the Concord chamber, the realization hit all at once. They're not defending Earth, one delegate said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're containing them. On the display, the fleet's movement slowed to near stillness, not by force, but by the absence of viable options. Every path outward intersected with the lattice. Every attempt to transmit beyond it failed or return altered. The invaders were still armed, still dangerous, but now they were isolated inside a system that no longer obeyed their understanding of space communication or control. Lena Cross finally allowed herself a breath. Not relief, recognition, because this was the moment everything shifted. Not the battle, the perception of it. Across the galaxy, every observation relay, every independent sensor array, every neutral monitoring station was receiving the same data. The same undeniable truth. The most powerful fleet in this region of space had entered a system it believed was weak, and it had been quietly, methodically dismantled without a single decisive strike. On the flagship, the Admiral looked out at the silent formation of his ships, suspended in a space that no longer belonged to him. "Open a channel," he said. "To whom, sir?" He did not hesitate. Earth. Because for the first time since the campaign began, he understood that this was no longer a battle he could win. It was a situation he needed to survive. And somewhere beneath the surface of that dark, silent world, the response was already waiting. It did not come immediately, because even now humanity was choosing when to speak. The response from Earth did not come from the planet. It came from everywhere else first. The moment the Admiral's request left the flagship, the containment lattice reacted. Not by blocking it, not by altering it, but by duplicating it. The signal fractured into hundreds of identical transmissions, each one routed through different nodes across the system. Asteroid relays, mining stations, civilian outposts, forgotten installations that had never once appeared in any strategic model. Every one of them received a message. Every one of them answered. The Admiral stood frozen as a command display flooded with responses. Not chaotic, not overlapping, but perfectly sequenced. Each signal carried the same simple confirmation. Message received. Not from Earth. From the network. "What is this?" One of his officers whispered, the edge of control finally cracking. The Admiral did not answer, because he was beginning to understand something far worse than defeat. This was not a single opponent. This was a system that had been designed to ensure no one could face Earth alone. Back in the Concord chamber, the realization landed like impact without sound. Delegates who had spent centuries studying power structures, alliances, and military hierarchies were now watching something that did not fit into any of those categories. "This isn't an alliance," one of them said, his voice low with disbelief. "No," another replied. "It's a response framework." Lena Cross remained still, her gaze fixed on a display as the network continued to expand its presence across every layer of the system. She had known this moment would come. What she had not known was how the Concorde would react when they finally saw it, because this was not just about the fleet anymore. It was about what humanity had built behind the silence. On the flagship, the Admiral forced his voice back into command. "Consolidate all units," he ordered. "Minimum movement. Defensive posture only." For the first time, the fleet obeyed without contradiction, not because the systems had stabilized, but because there was nothing left to interpret. The chaos had resolved into a new kind of order, one imposed from outside their control. A new signal appeared on the central display. This one did not fragment. This one did not duplicate. It came from a single origin point on Earth's surface, cutting through the lattice as if the network itself had made space for it. The connection established without resistance. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then a voice came through. Calm, clear, unhurried. "You've reached the part where you ask for terms." The Admiral held the silence for a second longer than necessary, then answered, "Yes." No posturing, no threats, no attempt to reclaim authority that no longer existed. Just the truth. "We are prepared to negotiate withdrawal." The response came immediately. "You already tried to leave." The Admiral's jaw tightened. "Then we are requesting safe passage." There was a pause this time. Not long, just enough to remind him who controlled it. "Before we discuss that," the voice continued, "there's something you need to understand." The display shifted, not to Earth, to something else. Data began to stream across the command interface. Archived communications, encrypted transmissions, intelligence reports the Admiral had never seen before. Each one traced back through his own command network, his own Empire systems, his own chain of authorization. Every document told the same story. The invasion had not been spontaneous. It had not been purely strategic. It had been influenced, carefully, repeatedly, over years. Every assessment that labeled Earth as weak, every projection that minimized risk, every recommendation that encouraged rapid action without deeper investigation, all of it traced back to a source that did not belong to his empire. "This is impossible," one of the officers said. "No," the Admiral said quietly. "It's not," because he had seen the pattern before. Not in this form, but in the outcome. Confidence built on incomplete data. Decisions made on assumptions that felt just accurate enough to trust. A push toward action that seemed logical at every step. Someone had guided them here. The voice from Earth spoke again. "You didn't miscalculate," it said. "You were calibrated." Back in the Concord chamber, the shock was immediate and total. Every delegate understood what that meant. This was not just an invasion gone wrong. This was manipulation on a scale none of them had ever considered possible. "Who did this?" one of them demanded, his composure finally breaking. Lena Cross did not answer, because she was watching something else. A secondary signal, buried beneath a flood of data, moving in a pattern that did not match the rest. Subtle, precise, and very much active. On the flagship, the Admiral saw it too. A fragment of communication, slipping through the network without being fully intercepted. Not blocked, not altered, just present. He isolated it, his hands moving faster now. Urgency replacing control. "What is that?" his officer asked. The Admiral didn't respond. He was already decoding, already understanding. And what he saw made something inside him go still. "It's still here," he said. "Sir." He looked up slowly. "Whatever sent us, it's still watching." The realization hit the chamber like a second shockwave. Because if that was true, then this was not the end of a failed invasion. It was the middle of something much larger. On Earth, deep beneath the surface, the voice on the channel paused, as if listening, as if something had just changed. Then, quietly it spoke again. "We see it too." And for the first time since the invasion began, there was something new in that calm, controlled tone. Not fear, not uncertainty. Something sharper. Interest, because the war that had just been won might not have been the one that mattered. The silence that followed was different. Not the controlled silence of trap, not the suffocating silence of a system waiting to respond. This one carried weight, shared, acknowledged, and understood by every observer across the network. The kind of silence that came when everyone in the room realized the problem had just become something much larger than any one battle. The Admiral did not look away from the data. "Transmit everything," he said quietly. "Sir?" his officer asked, uncertain. "Everything," he repeated. "Full logs, pre-campaign intelligence, external advisory channels. All of it. Send it through their network." There was hesitation, just a fraction of a second. Then the order was executed. Across the containment lattice, the fleet's internal records began to flow outward, not as a negotiation tactic, not as leverage, but as a statement. Every assumption, every manipulated projection, every recommendation that had guided the Empire into the system, all of it was now visible, not just to Earth, to everyone. Back in the Concord chamber, the effect was immediate. The data did not arrive as fragments or summaries. It came as raw truth, unfiltered and cross-referenced against independent archives in real time. Delegates who had once laughed at the idea of Earth as a threat were now watching the architecture of a deception that had shaped an entire campaign. This wasn't strategy, one of them said, his voice hollow. It was design. Lena Cross remained still as the final pieces aligned. Years of quiet observation, years of dismissed reports, years of watching patterns no one else had thought worth questioning. And now, at the exact moment when the truth mattered most, everything was finally visible. But visibility was not the same as understanding. On the flagship, the Admiral exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing not from relief, but from clarity. "We were never the objective," he said. No one responded, because they were already starting to understand. The fleet had been a tool, a force powerful enough to provoke a response, visible enough to draw attention, predictable enough to be guided. Everything about the campaign, the timing, the confidence, the assumptions, had been shaped to ensure one outcome. That Earth would reveal itself. And it had. The containment lattice, the perception grid, the hidden alliances, the coordinated response framework spanning an entire system. None of it had been exposed until now. None of it would have been if the invasion had not forced it into the open. Someone had wanted this. Someone had spent years making sure it would happen. On Earth, the voice on the channel spoke again, no longer just addressing the fleet. It addressed the network. All nodes, it said, calm but unmistakably deliberate. Full spectrum analysis. Track the origin of the interference pattern. Do not engage. Across the system, the response was immediate. Signals shifted. Data streams reconfigured. The same infrastructure that had contained the fleet now turned outward, scanning beyond the edges of the system, pushing into regions that had never been mapped in detail. For the first time since activation, the network was no longer focused inward. It was looking into the dark. Back in the Concord chamber, the implications settled like gravity. "They're not celebrating," one delegate said, almost to himself. "No," another replied, his voice quieter than before. "They're preparing." Lena finally stepped forward. "This isn't over," she said. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. Because of victory everyone had just witnessed, the dismantling of a superior fleet without direct confrontation, the exposure of a hidden manipulation spanning years, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one. On the flagship, the Admiral straightened, something in his expression shifting from defeat to something harder to define. "What are your terms?" he asked. This time, the response came without delay. "Immediate withdrawal," the voice said. "Full reparations. And you will stand before the Concord and confirm what you've just transmitted." The Admiral closed his eyes briefly. Then he nodded, agreed. There was no reason to refuse, because survival was no longer the only priority. Truth had become one. Across the system, the containment lattice began to loosen, not collapse, not disappear. It simply opened. Pathways that had been sealed now shifted, creating a control corridor leading outward. The fleet did not move immediately. It held position, as if waiting for confirmation that this was not another layer of the trap. It wasn't. This time, the choice was real. Back on Earth, deep within the command structure that had orchestrated everything, the final transmission was prepared. It was not sent to the fleet. It was not sent to the Concord. It was sent outward, beyond the system, beyond the regions anyone had ever needed to monitor before. The message was simple. "We found you." For a moment, nothing responded. Then, far beyond the reach of conventional sensors, something shifted. Not a signal, not a fleet, something quieter, something older. And whatever it was, it had just realized that the species it had spent years trying to manipulate into destruction had done something it had not predicted. They had survived. Together, back in the Concord chamber, no one spoke as the final data settled into place. The classification of humanity changed that day, but not in the way anyone expected. They were not labeled as the most dangerous species, not the most advanced, not the most aggressive. They were defined by something far more difficult to measure, a species that, when pushed to the edge, did not break. It adapted, it connected, It built, and when the moment came, it did not just defend itself. It changed the shape of the battlefield entirely. Lena Cross looked at the display one last time, then turned away because she knew something the rest of the chamber was only beginning to understand. This was not the story of how humanity won a war. This was the story of how humanity proved it was ready for the next one.